The presence of cavalry at Harper's Ferry in September 1862 is of no importance to the outcome of the Confederate investment of the place, except for one thing: the fact that Lincoln's brigadier, Julius White, exposed himself in his involvement in the decision to allow the troopers to leave the night of September 14th as a soldier in actual command. White came to the ferry from Winchester on September 2 with a company of the 1st Maryland Cavalry, commanded by a Presbyterian minister from Williamsport, Charles Russell, who left the ferry the night of September 13 with 9 men of the company, and reached McClellan, whose headquarters was somewhere between South Mountain and Frederick, at about 9 a.m. About the same time, the Union Ninth Corps began to climb the mountain toward Fox's Gap. White brought with him, too, a squadron of the 7th Rhode Island Cavalry made up of college kids, commanded by Major Augustus Corliss. When White came to the ferry the second time, arriving the night of September the 12th, the 12th Illinois Cavalry, a unit of perhaps 400 German immigrants that had been formed in June 1862 and had arrived at the ferry in July, came with him. The regiment's colonel was Amos Voss, a lawyer and politician. His lieutenant colonel was Hasbrook Davis, a sometime preacher and lawyer. Present at the ferry when White arrived there on September 12 was a company of Marylanders under the command of Henry Cole, some Virginians from Loudoun County under the command of Captain Means, and about 800 men composed of the 8th New York Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, which had arrived at the ferry from Baltimore on August the 30th under the command of Benjamin Davis, an 1854 West Point graduate who had served as a dragoon at Fort Fillmore in New Mexico when Colonel Miles was the fort's commander, and was with Miles at the slaughter of the Indians on the Gila. The record is not clear on whether the New Yorkers arrived with carbines, revolvers, or unarmed. Sometime after dark on Sunday night, September 14, Benjamin Davis led the column of cavalry across the pontoon bridge and down the road that passes between the cliffs of Maryland Heights and the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, turning onto the Sharpsburg Road, and then, meeting no Confederate picket force blocking the way, took the fork that leads through St. Paul Manors. The column crossed the Antietam and came into the town where the Lutheran Church sits at the intersection of the Boonesboro Pike. There, the troopers turned right and then left onto the Hagerstown Road, and passing behind General Lee's wing of the Confederate Army, came upon Lee's reserve ammunition train moving toward Williamsport, fell upon the teamsters, who were without escort, and went on to the Mason-Dixon line with 50 or so of Lee's wagons. Given Lee's letters written to Davis at the time the Army crossed the Potomac, the news of the loss of these wagons must have been disheartening to him, as the letters reflect the fact the Army was already deficient in long-range artillery shells. Yet, the loss did not deter General Lee from continuing the operation that would bring on the Battle of Antietam 3 days later. In the several reports Julius White submitted to the government after the surrender, he did not include any reference to what his involvement was in the decision to allow the cavalry to leave the ferry. White did not testify at the commission hearing held in October 1862. And in his piece that the Century magazine published some 24 years later, in 1886, titled The Capitulation of Harper's Ferry, White wrote only that Colonel Miles had made the decision upon the request of Benjamin Davis. Then, in 1887, an article was published in the Illinois Molus, written by a witness to the event, that disclosed the fact that when White arrived at the ferry on September the 12th, Davis had come to him with the request the cavalry be allowed to go, and White, thereafter, asserted his rank as brigadier general and informed Miles that he had decided the cavalry should go. In 1888, with the Century magazine about to republish his article in a special edition, White rewrote the piece, now stating that indeed he had, quote, taken command, unquote, of the cavalry at the time the decision was made. What is important here, in reaching a conclusion, who was the person actually responsible for allowing some 10,000 Union soldiers to surrender themselves without forcing the enemy to overwhelm them if they could? Is the fact that Lincoln's brigadier shirked his duty and professional responsibility by inducing Colonel Miles to allow himself to be used as a beard, allowed himself to be seen as the ostensible commander of the garrison when, in reality, he was not. Brigadier General Julius White was. Upon arriving at the ferry from Martinsburg on the 12th, White, as any reasonable person would have recognized under the circumstances, to hold the fort to the last extremity, as Major General Wool defined the term, the commander of the garrison at some point in the course of the impending investment would have to bring the men to the mark, to the point that they must fire their rifles in volley at the mass of charging Confederates coming at them up the slope of Bolivar Heights, and that somehow the Napoleons and howitzers and Colonel Miles' inventory of guns at Camp Hill would need to be substituted for Rigby's and Potts' batteries of Parrots and James rifles on Bolivar Heights, if the canister rounds were to be made efficient use of, blasting the face of the charging enemy mass, and that without the cavalry horses pulling the pieces into line, this substitution could not be done, for there were no military artillery horses available. And since White was smarting from the embarrassment caused in his mind by Wool's stripping him of his brigade on September 4, it was easy for him to seize upon Wool's conduct toward him as his ostensible excuse for inducing Miles to pretend he was still in command of the garrison. That this should be plain to most thinking persons, one need simply read the text of the letter White handed Colonel Miles the morning of September 13th, as Kershaw's brigade was crawling through the woods atop Elk Ridge toward the men of Sherrill's New Yorkers. After reciting Wool's previous orders and professing ignorance of the military situation, White tells Miles that he would not assert his rank and assume command quote, at least for the present, unquote. The mystery here is why would Miles accept this, writing as he did a silly note, using silly phrases such as, quote, white with a magnanimity equal to his valor, unquote, and White's, quote, high-toned, chivalric generosity, of which there are but few precedents in our army, overwhelms me with the deepest gratitude, unquote. The answer is obvious. We have here a wizened soldier with 40 years of soldier life under his belt, almost all of it spent in one frontier fort or another, in Texas and New Mexico, a soldier who shared in the battles of the Mexican War, who was personally known to Taylor and Wool and Scott, and who was among the most respected soldiers in Maryland, honored by its legislature and promoted by its governor and its senators in the Congress of the United States, a soldier of the regular army who had learned from his experience at Bull Run that the war was in the hands of the politicians who were making themselves generals overnight, and that he was a victim of the mad scramble among his erstwhile brothers in arms to gain the favor of the politicians and transform themselves from regular army captains and majors into colonels and volunteers overnight, as Richardson had done and Benjamin Davis had done and a host of others had done, advancing in a matter of months to brigadier generals and major generals. And here he was now, knowing what the reality was, that this puny politician general in front of him was quivering in his boots at the thought the responsibility was his to order the grape be thrown at the enemy climbing the slope of Bolivar Heights. And so we can read Miles' silly phrases and recognize they reek with his intended sarcasm, that his tongue is in his cheek, that since he cannot bring himself to call White out, force White to take responsibility for the outcome both men see coming, he allowed White to use him as a pawn